What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I kind of want to talk about the top 10 standard decks currently in MTG Arena. These decks currently have the highest win rates out of all the decks currently in the standard format for best of one. The one thing to note I will say about this, and I was quite impressed with all these decks that make this list, is that they all have over a 55% win rate in best of one, and then there's still a ton of decks after these decks that also still have over a 50% win rate, which I do think is a very good thing for a standard format. That means there's a lot of good decks that are very competitive overall in the format, and the fact that there's 10 decks that are at least over 55% win rate means that there is a decent diverse amount of decks that you could run into overall in the standard meta. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking through them. The first deck up on this list is going to be Selesnya Toxic. This is a deck that kind of caught me off guard. I was very surprised that this deck is fairly strong still in the current meta. It's a deck that, is just trying to do one thing. It's trying to poison out your opponent's life total, and I guess in the current meta, it's still very good, especially in best of one. I'm going to assume the culprit of this deck is going to be that Venerated Rot Priest, because whenever your creatures become target of a spell in general, they're going to get a poison counter, and we have a lot of ways of doing that. You can, Tyvar's Last Stand, you can soul partition your creatures, and you'll give your opponent poison. A lot of our creatures also have Toxic of either 1 or 2, and we have ways of producing tokens out on the battlefield like Skrell's Hive that also are ways of getting additional Toxic. So overall, this deck is very pesky, very annoying. It's definitely going to get yourself some games, get some wins, and actually when you look at it as a whole, it's actually not that expensive when it comes to overall rare and mythic wild cards, as most of the cards I think in the main deck are uncommons or rares, so I do think it's very approachable that way. If you bought heavily into this set, I'm sure there's a decent amount of these cards that you already own in your collection, but still, nonetheless, definitely a cool deck to check out if you do want to try out the poison mechanic in standard. This is definitely a good area to start with that. Coming in at number 9, we have Mono Red Burn. Mono Red Burn is a solid deck with only having 8 rares / mythics. It's a pretty competitive deck, coming in at 55.3% win rate with 88,000 matches played, so that win rate is pretty solid there at 88.3%. Overall, this deck is pretty approachable, pretty straightforward. The goal is just burning your opponent's face as quickly as possible. Has ways of increasing that amount of burn that you do to your opponent with the Mechanized Warfare, with it being a card that adds our red sources / artifacts dealing that much damage +1, so that scales pretty well with all our cards that deal damage. And I would say the only weakness to this deck is probably anyone who's going to be playing some sort of life gain, just because that is one of those ways of kind of counteracting the burn. If we can't get rid of their life gain source, they're kind of going to take over the game. Other than that, this deck is pretty solid from top to bottom. Very frustrating to play against. Definitely very easy to pick up and play if you're someone who's newer to the game and doesn't really grasp all the technicalities. This is pretty straightforward. Hit your opponent and burn your opponent, and you'll win the game. And Mono Red Burn is a very good deck to do that with. Coming in at number 8, we have Selesnya Enchantments. This is a deck that, just like Mono Red Burn, has been in the meta for quite some time. This is a deck that has 110,000 matches played with a 55.4% win rate. So just like Mono Red Burn, this is another list that is pretty solid from top to bottom. I think some of the biggest improvements to this list are going to be Calyx, as he's another card that's going to help overall improve your enchantments, whether it's getting additional copies of them or just being able to add additional +1/+1 counters. He himself has been like the biggest improvement to the deck overall. The rest of the cards have been pretty much the same ever since this deck has got released, but for the most part, I would say this is another strong deck to choose if you're someone who's looking for maybe something a little bit more synergized with enchantments. This could be the deck that is good for you. Coming in at number 7 on this list, we have 4-color Control, the first control deck on this list. It's not your typical control deck because it's not really playing counter spells in that way. It's playing a lot of ways of dealing with the battlefield in one way or the other. You have things like Go for the Throat, which is very typical in a deck that plays black. We have Virtue of Persistence, which is like a new removal spell with its -3/-3 ability and the ability to gain some life. You have Leyline Binding, you have Sunfell, and then you also have Archangel Wrath. So a lot of good ways of really dealing with the board state, especially early on, to get you into that late game. Plus, it has a decent amount of ramp with a lot of the green spells we have, this being a Treasure, Stomper, getting lands from the battlefield onto the battlefield tapped, and then you have also Invasion of Zendikar. So all very good options of ramping up overall. And I do think the main card that actually really helps this deck out is going to be the Up the Beanstalk. It makes all our more expensive spells that we're going to cast in the later game that much better, because we're going to get some sort of card advantage out of it, which definitely helps out overall. I will say the one thing to note when you add this into your collection to build is that it may show up as a 5-color deck, and that's the only reason why we have that is because we're playing lands of all the colors, because that will help us discount Leyline Binding and get the most out of Herd Migration if we ever do cast it for its full cost. Other than that, this deck is pretty straightforward. Deal with the board state early, play your more expensive spells later, hopefully get some card draw, and then pretty much take over the game that way. But with that being said, this is definitely a very solid deck from top to bottom, maybe a little more expensive than what we've shown off already here in the video, but definitely a good deck to maybe play if you're looking for something a little bit different but want to play control. The next deck up on this list is going to be Esper Legends. This is another deck archetype that's been in the meta for quite some time. This list has about a 56.2% win rate with about 31,000 matches played. Overall, this list is very solid from top to bottom, and the reason why is because it's able to play a lot of powerful creatures, because legendary creatures are typically really powerful. Also gives you discounts on all your legendary channel lands, and that is another good thing with this deck, as most of the time you are able to probably cast the channel lands for a much steeper discount than you normally would pay, just because the amount of legends that you could have out at any given time. It's a very powerful deck, definitely can overwhelm your opponent fairly quickly, just because it has a lot of cards that really punish your opponent and what maybe they're trying to do. Shield Drip being the main culprit, because whenever your opponent's looking for cards to kind of deal with what's going on in the battlefield, it's going to punish them for drawing those additional cards, and even punish them for just drawing at the beginning of their draw step. Combine that with cards like Thalia, which then tax their non-creature spells, making them more expensive. This deck is definitely fairly powerful overall. Coming in at number 5 on this list, we have Mono Red Aggro. This is another archetype that's been fairly popular in Standard for quite some time. This has a lot of matches played with 370,000. It has a 56.3% win rate. So this deck is quite honestly probably one of the most played decks currently in the current meta. Overall, this list is good from top to bottom. You have cards like Godric being added with Wilds of Eldraine, as well as Monstrous Rage, and then all the usual suspects that you would see in a typical mono red deck. I think Godric is probably one of the biggest improvements to this list because of its ability to be a 3-mana 3/3 with haste, with the possibility of being a 4/4 at any given point. And there are many ways of us putting additional cards on the battlefield to trigger that celebration pretty efficiently. And overall, that is just a very solid card in general. Then we also have cards like Monstrous Rage here, which Monstrous Rage combined that with a Monastery Swiftspear is quite powerful in itself, because Monastery Swiftspear is going to get the Prowess trigger off the Monstrous Rage. It will then get the +2/+0, and then it will also get the permanent +1/+1 and trample from the monster token that you then attach to it, so you can get a pretty healthy attack in with that for only possibly 2 mana at most. Overall, this list is pretty solid from top to bottom, and it makes sense as to why people also play this deck because of its proven success overall currently in the meta. Number 4, we have Naya Humans, and this is going to be the beginning of the trend that you'll see at the top of the meta in kind of focusing on one color or one archetype, I would say overall. Naya Humans is kind of a branch off of that archetype, it being a 56.4% win rate with only 85,000 matches played. It's still a very strong deck because it's playing all the other cards that are at in those other top meta decks, I would say overall. It just splashes into the other colors just to play a couple strong legendary creatures. Morelia is decently strong because of its ability to kind of tone down possible poison if you're maybe facing a poison and her exile ability is not that bad. You have Helena and Elena kind of buffing your creatures, making them a little bit harder to deal with and making your opponent have to have an answer for them. And then you have Sigarda here, which is just kind of like a human lord, which buffs all our humans, has Coven if we can get that to trigger, and also has Flying and Trample for 4 mana, which is definitely pretty decent. But with the rest of the list, it's pretty much playing the usual suspects you would see in a mono white deck in general, all of them being fairly strong cards, also punishing your opponent and being able to deal with what is going on your board. But with that being said, let's move into number 3. Moving into number 3, we have Mono White Soldiers. Mono White Soldiers, just like the other humans decks, are kind of one of these spin-offs from the main deck that you typically see in the meta. Mono White Soldiers is also fairly competitive, very solid from top to bottom. It does have a 57.7% win rate, and I do think overall this list is pretty solid from top to bottom. If you don't want to play the typical Soldiers deck that is currently existing in the meta, this is a decent way to kind of focus on one color instead of playing multiple colors, and you get access to some other cards that you typically would not be able to play in the other colored decks. This list has the typical cards you would see in any sort of soldier deck and or mono white deck. You have cards like Valiant Veteran, Siege Veteran, and Merrill for the soldiers. And then you have cards like Thalia, Brutal Cathar being like those typical cards you would see in a mono white deck, both being very powerful. And I do think this list is fairly solid from top to bottom, even if it's not maybe as strong as its other counterpart. These are definitely good decks, I would say, overall. So as I was hinting out with the previous list, we are now moving into Azorius Soldiers as our number 2 deck overall in the meta. This has about 45,000 games played with about 58% win rate. I would say this is another fun aggro deck. This is a deck that you do have access to some of the cards fairly early on in your MTG career, just because you do have a starter deck that is relatively a more simplified version of this list overall. But this list is fairly powerful. It does splash in blue for a couple cards, but for the rest of the deck, it's pretty similar to that mono white soldier deck that we just saw previously. The only reason why we're splashing in blue is for really two things. You have Harbin here, which is going to allow you to take your very wide board and get over the top by allowing yourself to attack with 5 or more soldiers, get +1/+1 and flying, which is going to be very good. Skystrike Officer is a built-in card draw mechanic because you can tap 3 untapped soldiers you control and you get to draw a card. And then whenever it attacks, you get to create a soldier token, which is definitely pretty solid. And then the last card that really makes the soldier deck kind of click and go is going to be the Fortified Beachhead. This is a dual land that really is focused on soldiers. And for 5 mana and tapping it, you can give your whole soldier team +1/+1 to end a turn. Overall, very solid list from top to bottom. Definitely a very good deck, I would say, that you could try out. And definitely a very approachable deck as a new player. And I did go over like this deck and some of these other decks you may see on this list in my budget deck video and kind of showing you how to upgrade all these various decks if this is kind of the archetype that you want to dive in and kind of play. And the final deck up here on this list is Mono White Humans. And like I said, the top of the list is kind of trending towards one way. Mono White is fairly strong, has some of the best cards here. And because of cards like Thalia, being able to tax your opponent's non-creature spells is definitely very punishing. Sure, this deck does play its own non-creature spells, but for the most part, it does play a lot of spells that are fairly powerful and makes dealing with the creatures in general very hard to deal with. I would say the only difference with this deck, maybe compared to the other Humans deck that I did show off on this list, is just Knight Errant of Eos. This is going to be a card that's going to help us dig into our library, hopefully find more creature cards based on the Convoke cost that we paid, and then we get to put those cards into our hand, allowing us to put more pressure on our opponent's life total. Typically, in a best of one, you're going to see a lot more aggro decks at the top of the list. There were a few more mid-range decks and also one control deck, but still, for the most part, aggro is going to reign supreme just because of its speed of being able to pressure your opponent's life total. Plus, there's no sideboarding, so you can be as aggressive as possible without really any punishment overall. But with that being said, I will leave a link down in the description below where I pulled this list from. This is just simply from my untapped.gg app. Pretty much what this is just a snapshot. I just showed you a snapshot of all of these decks at the top of the meta. There are also other decks I did not actually touch on in the meta that are still above 50% win rate. If it's something that maybe something you didn't see here is it piquing your eye, you can definitely check out untapped.gg. It's definitely a pretty solid app, I would say. They do a pretty good job about getting a snapshot of the overall meta, giving you an idea of what's been played, and they update pretty consistently, so the meta list is always updated. And then on each list, you can always see variations because not every deck is, Mono White Humans is just an archetype, but there are many variations of said Mono White Humans that may play some other cards that you may not see here. But with that being said, let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Or do you guys play any of these meta decks? Or are you interested in playing any of these meta decks? I have a video where I talk about some of these meta decks where I made budget versions to build up eventually to the top meta decks versions of them. If you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know I post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video.